an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering of Darkness and Dawn, Elder Empire, Shadow Book 2. Everybody, I'm starting with Shera. In these chapters, there are assassins coming to take out some of the greater powers. It is unclear to me what exactly has been organized, but a client gets shot in front of Shera and it feels rude. Like, just really rude. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to George for commissioning this episode. George is here in the chat. What's up? And George is very excited because the next two books were covered by, I believe, Asher. So this entire series is set to go. I will be done with it within the next few months. George says, I was about to commission it and saw, I guess I'll have to throw my money at a different series, but I'm very excited. Thumbs up. I am also very excited. I downloaded Will White's other series, Traveler's Gate, because it's like free on Audible with a subscription right now. So I haven't started them, but I am interested because apparently they were re-recorded with, apparently Will did like his own narration the first time, which is not surprising. I guess that makes sense. But anyway, this is not about that. So just FYI, I always go over time when I'm covering Will's stuff because he is hella dense. And I decided to, when George and I were figuring out how we were going to schedule this, we're under scheduling the number of pages per episode even more than we have done in the past. So I'm only covering chapters 1 and 2 for this one. And it's going to be similarly like small segments going forward. But I just wanted to let you guys know, if you're following along, some people will be like, that wasn't 50 pages. I know, and it's on purpose. Trust me. Anybody who was there and saw how hard it was for me to stay on target with the most recent Cradle book, Reaper, we wound up having to like schedule an extra episode of coverage because I wasn't doing it. I wasn't keeping up. Okay. Chapter 1. We spend most of this chapter learning about some different powers and the way that they are being targeted by people. In the first one is a way that feels sort of, I don't want to say predictable, but it's something that you can see coming because the guy seems like a real tyrant and a maniac. But then we follow up with somebody who's actually like trying to do good and genuinely, it seems to me, attempting to help the community, and she seems to have a conscience. And so the fact that they go after her, I found genuinely surprising. And it feels like there's a real specific goal behind them being targeted. But I will be honest, I don't know what to call them. I keep saying powers, but I want to say elders. They're not actually, though, right? Like, they're people who have gotten, it seems like, just really bonkers soul-bound artifacts in a few cases. So I don't really... Oh, Regents are their title. Okay. I thought that was just the position of the one guy. I didn't realize that was like each of them. Okay, cool. Thank you, George. See, this is why I like having the chat. People can help me out here. So his name, the first one, Allegius, Regent of the East, hadn't sat and received petitioners in almost 500 years. And this is the guy that I was saying is a real tyrant and a maniac. It's so much fun to read tyrants and maniacs from their own POV, especially when it's Will White writing. Not to say other writers can't pull this off, but there are some writers who I feel like they're trying to do something interesting and it comes off a little bit more almost like sadistic or self-indulgent in a way that isn't fun to read. It's certainly informative and it gives you a real perspective that feels genuine, but it doesn't feel like I'm excited to see what it's like in their POV. So this dude is posturing feels like too strong a word because he can clearly back up what he's doing and saying, but he's certainly more self-conscious than he like wants to admit. And there is a sense of like, if people are more afraid of me than they are perceptive, I will certainly not complain about it. You know, he doesn't want folks who look at him with any sort of critical eye, examining his reasons for doing things or second guessing or asking questions. He wants people to be completely in awe and accepting of the fact that they are his inferiors and he is a god, essentially. And so this woman who deals with him is a professional in a way that I almost wondered if we were going to find out that this was Shera. And I don't know if she is going to turn out to have been like trained by the gardeners or something, if she will have had any relation, or if I was maybe supposed to pick up on who she was. Full disclosure, everybody. I didn't, the last book I finished sometime last spring, maybe. It's been a long time since the first pair of books in this series. So if there are people that turn up that I should recognize or names that I should be like, oh, that's this guy, and I'm not getting it, please feel free to tell me because I may just not be putting together things as well as I would if I had just read it. I thought about going back and re-listening to the ends of the last books, but I'm in the middle of listening to Stormlight Archive, and so I didn't want to like stop in the middle of that and muddle things. So this dude the castle around him was hardly appropriate to his grandeur, mere blocks of stone raised from the quarries of Erin. Erin was what they called this tiny continent, which had once been the border of Tharlos and Othagor, the site of constant war between life and chaos. There were worlds of unimaginable wonders beneath their feet, palaces built from the bones of giants and crystals that outshone the moon, but they had tried to give him a home of matchsticks. Nothing lasting was ever made of wood. So he is creating this castle. And by he, I mean like he designs it and then he assigns all of these people to work on it. That is going to take decades to finish. And this is the kind of thing that I'm always like... I always think about the amount of work that went into creating certain like structures in the world. You look at Westminster Abbey, for example, which is one that I always think of because I've been there and genuinely stood in the doorway and looked around like, how did they do this? The amount of detailing and everything in it is so completely mind-boggling that I don't even understand how you begin to go about designing something like it when there are so many details. It feels like you would spend years just designing before you even got started, kind of thing, which is part of why probably I'm not an architect. But this sort of thing where he crafted a castle and has people like working on it to give it the details. So it's like he pulls the stone out of the earth, but it's not shaped in the ways that he wants. I mean, I understand wanting something like really beautiful and cool, but also, man, what are you trying to prove? And as we know, he's trying to prove quite a lot, actually. He sat in a throne of polished granite with marble beneath his feet and a staff of gold in his hand, awaiting the arrival of a supplicant pleading his mercy. For the first time in the 2 years since he'd been roused from his deep slumber, he felt something approaching contentment. So this is the thing that happens with each of the beings that we are seeing and meeting, is that they were asleep and now they are awake. And it's a cyclical thing where they go to sleep for a few hundred years and then wake up and rule for a time, and then they go back to sleep. And it's unclear to me how this was established, how their nature of sleep, because the sleeping that we have heard of is the elders that have been sent to sleep as a means of keeping them at bay, right? It was meant to be sort of a stasis, and it doesn't feel like that's exactly the case here if they are periodically waking up. And it's not an exception when they wake up. It's part of how things are meant to go. So I'm really curious exactly how it works that they wake. Why do they wake when they do? Why do they go to sleep again when they do? And why are they preserved? Who is watching over their body? There's a mention by him and by the woman later about coming out of their box or their coffin. So it seems like they're in the same body that they had been. And I may be wrong about that. It may be either a metaphor or it's simply their essence of themselves going into a box and then being taken out and they reform a new body. But it seems like it's the same body. And I just really want to know exactly how this started, that they are able to take a periodic rest between ruling to the point that they come out of their sleep and have to be educated on the new types of speech, the new methods of just interacting and dealing with the locals, and what a weird situation. And especially this dude, the other woman who had seemed to be working for the people, I can completely understand them being oh yeah, we want to keep her around. But this dude seems like he sucks. So maybe it's just straight fear that had people helping to preserve him if that were the case. But if I were in their position and this guy went into his slumber, low key, I'm bringing him aboard a ship and just dropping that shit in the ocean somewhere. I don't know. Maybe he's not killable. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe they just don't know how to deal with somebody like this. But I wouldn't really be doing too much to ensure his return. That's all I'm saying. So he tells them to let the peasant approach. And there's this woman, and she is wringing a kerchief in her hands. And I sort of noticed this, and I think this is where she's hiding the needle or dart or whatever it is that she uses, because he looks at it with such contempt that it doesn't occur to him that it's sort of a suspicious thing. He doesn't seem to worry at all about anybody ever trying to attack him. It's simply not. It's so not a consideration that there is no paranoia surrounding it for him. Some rulers would be extremely suspicious of everybody because there is a sort of insecurity there, knowing that they are they are mortal. And this guy doesn't see things that way, because as far as he's concerned, if they make any move against him, all he has to do is think about crumbling them to dust, and it's going to happen almost instantly. But evidently, the technology has come a bit of a ways since that had been the case, and he is not prepared to deal with the way folks are going to approach their problems in the present. So we have this description of the soul-bound object. Let's see, I'm trying to find the spot here. His skin was dark like that of the emperor, displaying his proud Heartlander heritage, and his eyes, he was sure, held all the wisdom of 1,000 years. I adore that line. His eyes, he was sure, held all the wisdom of 1,000 years. It's not that it does. It's that he thinks it does, which is sort of pitiful a little bit. I really like it. He had only experienced about 100 of those years firsthand, but surely his decades warring with the elders counted as centuries. So, okay, I hadn't caught this, thinking that, are they elders? But he's warring with them, so evidently not. His golden staff, its head twining around an emerald the size of his fist, contained enough power to level cities. Indeed, it was the intent in this awakened artifact that had raised the castle around him. The crystallized heart of an ancient chimera was held in this staff, crystallized by his own intent and a secret process of alchemy. He was one of the first soulbound in the world, and certainly the strongest. And then it says, the thoughts of Esther VI and the Emperor flitted through his mind, but he pushed them aside. And so, yeah, again, insecure. He thinks about the Emperor, but the Emperor's dead. He thinks about Esther, but she isn't ruling in the way that he thinks is actually fitting to the word rule. Her trying to coexist and help, it's like a foreign concept to him. Truly beneath her as far as he is concerned. She would eventually allow time to bring her low, which he never intended to age another day. And so this woman kneeling this is what's fascinating to me, is that he is reading her intent. And he is so sure he knows what she's feeling. And I have to imagine that she's manipulating that, because there's no way she goes from genuinely abject to then an assassination attempt. So how is she convincing somebody who seems to have the kind of perception that he has, that she is feeling and thinking completely different things than she is? Unless she's somehow actually making herself feel them. I don't know if that's something that one can learn to do. People who are on-screen actors, they have to tap into certain emotions to portray them in a genuine way on screen. So even though they may not actually be in danger, there can be times where they have tapped into a real panic and they get their body sort of convinced it's real. And I'm wondering if it's something like that, where she just acts with such connection to what she's supposed to be exhibiting to him that it truly comes across as genuine. Or if there's something other that they have figured out as a way to project a false front that he can't see through. So she's talking to him, and she says, the soldiers have been a little bit restless and things are getting real bad. I abolished the army, he said, confused. There was no need of an imperial army under his regency, at least not in his quadrant. There could be no Aurelian empire without an emperor, so it was pure foolishness to keep standing Aurelian army. He and his privately trained readers in Soulbound would be enough force to combat any assault. George says he does say later he isn't really reading people individually and just reading the room as a whole. So he just senses general determination and fear, and then he rationalizes that as reverence. Oh, that's fun. Okay, thank you, George, for that. I didn't catch that. But that's determination and fear, and he's going to think it's fear of me because they worship me, and he's not actually assigning that emotion to the correct motivation. Okay, that makes sense. I like it. So this is when she tells him that the soldiers, yes, he did abolish the army, but they don't have anything to do anymore. So now they're just kind of fucking with people. And she says, they took my son to join them, though he didn't want to. They took all the food in my house. They took every coin I had. I tried to go to the guilds, but they sent me to you. And he gets real irritated over the fact that she even went to the guilds at all. The fact that she mentions them just irritates him, and he feels the need to sort of like make a point before he gets on with it, because he just wants her to like know that the guilds are... They're so far beneath him that her mentioning she tried them first is like kind of insulting. He should be the first one she goes to. It shouldn't even be a question. So, the ancient Black Watch would have never allowed such a disgraceful eruption in elder activity as followed the Emperor's death. They would have captured any elders, killed the Elder Touch, and burned whole villages to the ground until the threat was contained. The Luminian Order had begun preaching peace. They who had once led humanity to war, and the Magisters. They were the worst of all. Rather than plumbing the depths of reading and the infinite power of human intent, they spent their time trying to dredge up artifacts of a past they knew nothing about. The guilds were useless. Of course they would be no help. It infuriated him that anyone would think otherwise. So he calms himself down after the floor begins shaking. He's trying very hard to do his intimidation thing. And she looks so scared, and it's very pleasing to him that she looks as scared as she should in his mind of his wrath and majesty, that he decides, okay, well, she so clearly knows her place. I'm going to try and be nice to her. And he then says, I'm going to take care of this for you, because she's like, they're gathering today and they're planning to rise up against you. And he's like, insurrection? Oh, sweet. This is actually exactly what I want, because I have needed a way to exhibit my power again, to quell any thoughts of dissension. This is like feeding right into the exact thing I want to do. So he opens a window, as he puts it, and his intent rushed through his staff, pushing out of the chimera heart at the end, his soul-bound vessel seizing the earth of the wall. Half a second after he glanced at the wall, a massive square chunk of stone slid out. The 10-ton block skidded out with a deafening sound of grinding rock, crashing to the square below like thunder. Dust billowed, and a few people screamed, but that was all beyond him. His senses had already moved on. So this is the thing, like, he's doing this, and there is every possibility that he killed a couple people doing this, but he has no interest, does not care. So he watched the bigger picture, the currents weaving through the ocean of intent. The Emperor was always so proud of his ability to see into a man's heart. Algius could read the intentions of entire cities, working broadly on the scale of whole armies and vast mountains. No one in all of history could match Algius. So he sees people that are suffering, starving, places that have been burned down, people who are homeless, and he is just, again, not interested. This doesn't even seem connected to him. And then finally, he finds it. He focuses on the western edge, narrowing his sight from the whole tapestry to a single thread. A group of men meet, discussing anger and desperation. They plot against their ruler for some imagined slight, a futile ploy from futile men. A lack of purpose is the fuel in this fire, and if Algius were so inclined, he could crush their nascent rebellion by hiring them into his personal guard. But he has no need of a guard, and he must send a message. So, again, here, he has no need of a guard. Like, if he weren't this arrogant, maybe this wouldn't have wound up happening to him. These men are hoarding weapons, their intent flowing into the tools in little eddies of violence and reluctance, just in case, they tell themselves. So, he taps the emerald heart against the floor of the castle. The chimera's natural control over stone joined with his intent, guided by his will, rippling out over the city. Power washed over the central streets, leaving a few readers confused but affecting no one. The hungry in the eastern quarters noticed nothing, unharmed. just before the wave of intent hit the ex-soldiers massing at the western edge of town, he gestured at the peasant woman to come forward. "Attend and watch," he said. "This is the help I send those loyal to me." So she steps forward and she's shaking. And again, she doesn't stand side by side with him, which he interprets as respect, and is like, good, she shouldn't. That would be her presuming to be unequal with me, and she's not. His vision was too broad to read her intent clearly. Right, here it is. But her feelings merged with the rest of the castle's, and he caught broad notes of fear and intimidation, everything in its place. So he blows up the area where these men are. And as this is happening, he realizes that this woman said that her son had been taken with them, and decides that he is going to tell her why this was a necessary sacrifice, because he can't admit that it was a mistake, because he's meant to be a god and they don't make mistakes. Everything is purposeful. So even though it's definitely genuinely an forgot about him, it's going to be played off as something that's like almost a noble kind of, sacrifice that she made as if it were voluntary. Through her entire life, she would never forget to respect him, which is truly like, if this weren't what it is, if this weren't an assassination attempt, and she were just a regular woman, like, I am assuming that he would have just earned an enemy for life, but I don't know how much that would matter if she were just a regular person. But yeah, he seems to think that, like, oh yeah, this would make her respect me. Or it would just make her realize that she made a terrible mistake in coming to you. So something pricked his neck like a stinging insect, and he raised a hand to swat it away, only to realize with a flare of irritation that his hand wouldn't obey his command. For a brief moment it seemed absurd. The earth could erupt beneath his enemies a mile away, but his own hand staged a coup? Then came a second sting on the other side of his neck, and a length of impossibly cold pain in his back. The woman's face leaned over his shoulder as though she were peering past him to get a better look. "You won't destroy the empire," she whispered in his ear. "We will stand united without you." I love this so much. He is so mad that she would dare to try and kill him without, like, answering questions, because he wants to know so much about why she's doing this, who she is, who would have put her up to this. And the crystallized emerald heart pulsed one last slow message to him. It didn't come in so many words, but the general impression was clear. As the earth rests, so do we. And who had the ability to slay Algius, the shaper of deserts and builder of cities? He who had laid the bedrock of the empire and buried the great elders. That's pretty interesting. He was meant to die under the claws of Cathanakar on the blades of legendary assassins, not stabbed in the back by a peasant. Not alone, in a castle he had built with his will. Not like this. And then we go to Esther 6. And that's what's sort of fun about this, is that he gets murdered and I'm just kind of like, fucking good. And then we go to somebody that it does not feel good. This is somebody that I'm genuinely like, well, guys, wait, what? And granted, it's not as if the soulbound artifacts that Esther is using aren't trying to influence her to do awful things. But she seems very aware that's what's happening and is completely in opposition to them all the time, constantly fighting back against these impulses. So every year when the pass is thawed, the tribes would go to war with one another. They were more like festivals compared to the Elder War, but they had seemed serious enough at the time. Few people outright died, but many were shamed or exiled, some mutilated or injured beyond repair. The families fought for rank, and the highest-ranking families earned the right to live lower down the mountain. The storms were weaker, the food more plentiful, but the enemies closer. The strongest deserved to live at the base because they had to stay strong enough to repel outsiders. So her family was 14th when she was little, and they lived up way high. They hardly had any food, and winter was like absolutely brutal and would almost always kill at least one or two people. And eventually she starts to get really fucking over it. She has to do something. So she enters the high passes with a spear, and she slays a hydra, a cloud seeker, who flew above the clouds and summoned blizzards who could overturn mountain peaks with the force of its intent. The body alone would have sold for a fortune, enough to keep her family safe for many winters, but she didn't come home. She cut off the head and carried it with her, strapped to her back, until she found a second Cloudseeker Hydra. This one was bigger. And so she goes like this, and she gets a third one and bonds them, all three, as her soul-bound vessels, which evidently just rotate around her head now. And these are what she uses to begin aiding her family in ascending the ranks so that they can descend the mountain. The man they called the Liberator had started a war against Nakothi, and all the great elders were stirred up. She defeated the 8 families that showed up for the Spring Wars all at once. Thus, in one leap, did Esther 14 become Esther 6. Even when the ambassadors of Kellerak came to her passes and the worms of Cathanakar passed beneath her feet, she still ignored all news of the war. Her family was warm and safe, and they had access to more food than she had ever imagined. And, of course, they are all deeply grateful to her and praise her. And there's, we all have our ego, and that feels good. So she traveled to seek out other families and demonstrate her strength. By the time of the next springtime wars, she intended to be Esther 1. So she's just going to go around and just, kill these people or just, defeat them, depending, I guess. Cathanakar, the Worm Lord, descends before she can grasp her enemy, and all of her people were dead. She would be Esther 6 forever. She had battled the Great Elder himself on the slopes of the mountain where she'd been born. There were no mountains there anymore. Today, people called it the Dillian Basin, which, wild. That would have been something I'd like to see. Until her death, she would protect it as its regent. This time, no one and nothing would take away the people under her watch, not a great elder itself, and not whatever this was. So she's looking at this patch of grain that's blighted, and it's purple, which is wild. And these people that she's talking to are saying that they thought maybe it was elders that did it. And she's watching all of this, trying to figure out, it doesn't seem like an elder, but there's also elders out there that aren't as high level. So maybe there is just a weird one. And she tells him to bring a sample of the soil to the nearest Canatalia chapter house. So she wants them to have it tested to see what's going on. And we have this moment of her thinking about, what's his name? The name of the other one? I already forgot. But she's thinking about him and his death and has this pang of grief. And all of the skulls are yelling at her not to mourn him. Become him. Do not mourn him. Rule as he should have, as only you rule. And all of it, again, is the kind of thing that clearly was influencing him as well, that he actually caved to. We watched the way that he handled people and ruling, and he really believed the bullshit that his soulbound object was feeding him. And she is aware that's what's happening here and is not trying to let that happen to her. So she focused on the fondness for the modern people rather than her vessel's disdain. And she says, I'll take care of it. And he's like, but the blight. And she sends a flood of intent and seizes the entire crop In an invisible hand, she scooped up the soil and wheat alike, gouging a crater out of the field. The ball of dirt hovered in the air, big enough to bury a big chunk of the houses behind her, and she piled it to the side. Now it won't spread. Take a sample, get it checked out, and I'll replant your crop myself. If you lose a single stalk, your family's eating at my table this winter. Judging from the flow of his intent, the man was struggling to decide whether to be horrified at her treatment of his crops, awed at her power, or moved by her generosity. Tears appeared in his eyes, and he started stammering, but she laughed and walked on. And this is sort of interesting because a part of me is wondering if he knew what was going to happen, and maybe part of the tears here were him feeling like bad about being part of it. Unclear how much the link is there between like the assassins and the regular people. Also, like, you know, the previous dude, the whole thing with him and like destroying this center of potential insurrection, I have to assume that this plan involved a tactical sacrifice, and that those people knew that this woman was going to be like drawing his attention in order to distract him so that she could try and take him down. So were they in a location for him to find, knowing that he was going to kill them? Like, that's a pretty intense position to be in. Oh, sorry. George has all these comments here I missed. I don't know if you remember, but it's also interesting since some of the chapter informational blurbs from the last book were from Esther. Oh, I don't remember that. Thank you, George. So we've seen the Journal of Esther 6 talking about becoming a soulbound. I thought her name sounded like vaguely familiar, but okay, cool. She also was referenced as a legend, the similar way the emperor was talked about. I also just checked the last book, and there was one sentence about the regents that said they weren't immortal in the same way the emperor was, but they had helped him found the empire. She was feeling sadness about the emperor being dead because she thought he could have shaped all the modern language to be less formal just to make her more comfortable the next time she woke up. Yeah, this is a cute thing, the idea of like waking up in different eras, having to learn the way people speak, and maybe just not liking this era. Like, you know, depending on when you wake up and the kind of personality you have, it just doesn't work for you. So the one she's in currently, where people are extremely direct, she's a lot more about this one. The previous one she had woken up in apparently was like extremely formal and stilted in a way that felt really unnatural. And she's very relieved that's not what's going on with language anymore. So she is, it says, Esther lifted herself into the air, her skull spinning in a macabre halo over her head. She rarely thought about their power merging with her intent anymore. She just used them. It took even less thought than using her hands. Only when they blazed with ambition did she have to put them down. It was always a struggle, but the habit was most important. Each time she told them no, she strengthened her barrier against them. I really like that in particular, because there is some truth to that just in real, regular, everyday life, that if you have like an impulse in you to do something that's just not good for you or maybe other people, the more you put up a boundary, the more like natural that begins to feel, even if it doesn't seem like you're ever going to get to a place where it feels natural at first. And there had once been a debate about whether Soulbound really fought against the desires of their vessels, or if the vessels merely reflected hidden pieces of the Soulbound's personality. Esther suspected, like many debates, the truth remained hidden in the middle. And that makes more sense to me as well. She's like, yeah, they're arrogant and they think they're better than everybody, but I also was like arrogant enough to challenge them. So that probably does say something about me, which I like. That's some, you know, self-awareness there. And she sees this column of smoke going up. And when she like lands there, all of these people are, the woman says it was Yolvik's house. We got it so it won't spread. And he's on a trip abroad. And she's standing there like, okay, let me figure out what I can do here. I can at least put it out and help them save some of his property. And as she is about to begin this, a dude runs past her screaming about his baby and how his baby is in there. And she almost tries to stop him because it's such a foolish thing to run in as just a regular mortal, but stops herself from trying to make a choice for him and tells herself that he has the right to do this if it's his child. Again, a real moment of her genuinely attempting to resist the urge to just tell everybody around her how to live and what to do. So she pursues him inside. And there are all of these things that she can sense through her reading of the objects inside, but there is no child, and there is no indication of anything that would mean a child lived here anytime recently. And she steps inside just kind of wait, I don't... And then she hears a gun go off. And this dude used an invested gun. He shot her, and she had this bubble up to protect herself. So it hits the bubble and she goes flying. Invested bullets were notoriously unreliable, jamming or altering the mechanics of the gun 9 times out of 10, and firearms were too complex to be reliably invested, much less awakened. But he had fired a bullet that had ripped through her intent. It had to be awakened at the very least. He raised a second pistol, finger tightening on the trigger. The skulls roared, and Esther found herself involuntarily sucked into a reader's trance. So this is really interesting. She sees the next part as it actually happened from both her own perspective and from the Hydra's. Esther stands over the bleeding chimera, blonde hair blowing in the wind, clutching a jagged stone knife. "Grant me your power," she whispers, and her intent flows into the corpse. She cuts, the Hydra's neck flares with a line of pain, and her own pride merges with that of the dying creature. The ball of lead froze in midair. The would-be assassin's hand flicked to his belt where he kept a pair of knives, but she wrapped him in an invisible grip. Around her, the smoke fled. "You missed your chance," she whispered. But he heard her. At her words, his intent sickened with pure fear. She blasted him out the side wall along with half the house. So she pursues him. After tossing him, he's throwing up. And he pulls this tiny knife, and she's just what are you even doing? How did you think you had a chance of even pulling this off? And he says again, "You won't destroy the empire. We stand united. You and I are about to have a long talk." "I won't betray," he began, but she'd heard it before. With a flick of her thoughts, she wrung his left leg like a towel. Okay, it doesn't have to be a long talk. And his body, he's grinning at her because she thinks that she's going to be able to force out this information. And he's just yeah, that's not happening. And all of a sudden he begins trembling. And she looks at his wrist, and there is something embedded in his vein. He used something to commit suicide so that she wouldn't be able to get information out of him. Her vessels howled at her. "Do not tolerate this disrespect. Hunt down those who sent him, his friends, his family. Show them that you alone rule." And again, she forced them back. She'd slept for 12 centuries, but she lived almost 3. Decades of experience kept her will clad in iron, but she knew she could never slip even once. It was the knife's edge on which she balanced her entire life. As she flew away, she spared one last thought for the man's corpse. She threw it so far, so fast, that it burned to scraps before it landed. So yeah, I gotta say, I was very relieved that she makes it, because I thought for sure we're just going to see another death, but it's going to be somebody that we are going to be sadder to lose. But it feels like we like her more because she has more awareness. And part of having awareness is not being so arrogant that you think of everyone else as no possible threat. She's enough on her guard and just generally compassionate enough to like sense what's happening with other people in a way that he hadn't been. And it's just paying off for her, you know? So let me go to chapter 2. And we've got 12 men in the red suits of an imperial prison chained together at the ankle, shuffling side by side down the worn forest path. They are walking to their execution. And it's interesting here because they're like trying to mess with each other, but they don't go after the captors who wear black. Only a precious few in all the empire would have recognized gardeners on sight. Nonetheless, the prisoners took care not to offer even the appearance of a threat. Someone had taught them a lesson. So we've got gardeners here, and from far away, Shera is watching all of this through binoculars. The prisoners are in this like quarry area, but there's a ton of jungle in there. And it says the narrow path through which they entered loomed behind them, but none of them would try escaping that way. That would only mean faster execution. In short order, the men in red were unchained, rubbing chafed ankles and stretching long unused muscles. One of the black-clad men opened up a long, locked chest that sat next to him on the ground. He reached inside, emerging with a long-barreled musket, which he promptly loaded and handed to the first prisoner in line. Shera lowered the spyglass to glare at Carrion. "It looks like you gave them guns." The High Counselor brushed a few of her dangling braids back behind her ear. "Distances can play tricks on your eyes." And she looks again. "No, I'm pretty sure you have given them guns." So, what is going on here is that this is going to be a test. Because Shera has this new weapon. She is soul-bound to it. And they are trying to see how in control she is and how, like, on it she is, despite the distraction of this voice in her mind that's making her less stable than she had been. And that is really putting it mildly. So the council determined this would be the greatest measure of your newfound abilities. Who gave them the impression I would be able to defeat 12 men armed with guns, Carrion? And Carrion just kind of like doesn't really answer her, but it's very clear. So she's watching them, and then all of a sudden the voice from the knife comes through and is like, "Are they prey? Like, do we get to kill them? Is this what it looks like? Because that sounds exactly like what I'm wanting, and this would be great." It was the guards that interested that voice the most. They were the healthiest, the strongest, the best trained. One of them shone brighter than the others, and she took that to mean he had some talent for reading. "Ours," her knife whispered, and some part of Shera agreed. 2 of the consultants down there were gardeners from a different generation than Shera, assassins she'd never met. They might be better fighters than she was, but she had an awakened blade. Surely that would give her an advantage. And what we find out is that basically the fact that there is another voice in your head isn't really a publicized detail about what it's like having a soul-bound vessel. Nobody like really talks about this, which I find weird. I would think this would be the foremost thing that you would find out, that people would share, you know? Maybe they don't want people to be afraid of them or try to like hurt them, because if they don't know this object is constantly trying to urge me to do the worst possible thing, they won't feel as threatened. I don't know. But so she is staring down, just like trying to calm this voice. And Kyrian says, these 12 men have been sentenced to die. And does this kind of spiel. And then is like, do you understand the responsibility? And this is when we are reminded that Kyrian really does try to do things by the book when she can. Kyrian is a bit of a rule follower. That's not to say that she won't do what needs doing, even if it's outside the rules. But if she can, she is going to like stay within the lines. So she's told that there's an 1.5-hour time limit. And she is, again, like really hovering between excitement for doing this and just really not wanting to be put in this position at all. She's really pulled in two directions. And like the not wanting to be doing this direction is very much nap oriented. Again, she still wants to sleep all the time. So when she asks if there's a time limit, part of that is because if she isn't under enough of a time limit, she would have just like laid down and taken a nap real quick before getting started. So she heads down there. The man beneath her was Vendenian. Vendenian? Is that how you say that? Vendenian. Almost 7 feet tall, with caramel skin and a missing ear. He placed his musket against the trunk of a tree, taking a swig from a broad leaf. A certain species of plant had been placed in this valley for exactly that purpose, to catch rain so that thirsty survivors would be lured to specific locations for a drink. The Green Wardens called them jungle teacups. That's so mean. That's just really mean. Oh, man. Sorry, George says also maybe cradle spoiler, but it sounds like she's practicing her willpower just like Yaren in her Blood Shadow. Yeah, that is a real like constant theme for Will White, it feels like, is people building up a willpower or a discipline in certain regards. And honestly, it makes sense coming from a guy who's just a maniac about writing constantly all the time, churning out books at a rate that is like more than human, actually. Oh yeah. And George says when that guy was running into the fire, you can see how intent can be a disguise, where she just feels him, quote, focused on something to the exclusion of all other thought. True. So it's not like there's no like explanation of the goal exactly in that intent, but it's simply a single-mindedness, and that could be taken in a lot of different directions. That makes sense. So she takes this guy down. She takes down a bunch of them. And Cyphrin, her blade, is delighted. Every time that it takes a life, the sort of like power in these people is drawn into her, and her senses all become a lot more acute, and a lot of the sensations of everything, from the killing to the running to the environment around her, all of that becomes elevated. And this is, she's thinking about how like killing these people, sure, she's able to pull a little bit of power, but it's nothing like when she like killed the handmaiden, where that was so intense a rush that she got knocked out. These were snacks beside a full meal. Murder had never concerned Shera. Killing a man was no different than killing an animal, and often easier. But these thoughts made her uneasy. Taking a life with Cyphrin felt more like cannibalism than execution. And looking forward to it, those were thoughts she imagined an elder might have. So again, somebody who is like aware, she's not just letting this take over her. She is trying to fight back. Granted, she's not always totally successful. So there's this moment here. She takes down a bunch of these dudes, and there is a guy who... So she sees movement. the shear tumbled through the air, smacking into a bush. She caught a glimpse of black cloth. "I wonder if there's someone there," Shera said loudly. A consultant stepped out from behind the bush, palms up to show he wasn't carrying his weapon. 2 hilts poked out from the back of his belt, showing he carried shears of his own. A gardener. And he tells her, "A high counselor asked me to observe you. I am apparently not as good at hiding as I thought. I don't have the skill." And then there's this weird moment where she's looking around and he says there are 12 targets and we only have 11 bodies. And she is just so confident that if she can't sense any other people, there aren't any. So it's so strange to me because she just seems completely willing to accept that this guy is who he says. And the first thing that I thought was like, well, maybe he is the 12th target and he's like conning you somehow. How would that work? I don't even know. But there's something really like suspicious about the whole way that this goes down, considering that they're trying to test her. I can't help but think they may be trying to test her on more levels than simply fighting in a simple, straightforward, come and get these people kind of fight. I don't know. He says you have another target remaining. Her soulbound powers were new and strange, and she didn't like the way they made her feel, but she had already learned to trust them. If she sensed no one else in the jungle besides the 2 of them, then there was no one there. And she's passing by and like kind of just leaves him standing there. And then even though he second guessed her initially, he just lets her leave at this point. And she starts like letting her mind get away from her here. She thinks about Lucan. And all of a sudden she stops cold because she realizes that if she goes to see Lucan, she could probably use Cyphrin to pull a ton of his power out. And when she realizes that's how she's thinking, she gets really freaked out. Understandably. There's like, you know, just as regular people, our minds can betray us in a lot of ways. And it's already scary enough. Not adding in like this kind of bullshit. No, thank you. So then we go to her guarding Joran Mazewalker, Regent of the South. Now, Joran, this dude, so he's another one of these regents, but we know him, right? Isn't he one of the guys that was like responsible for making a bunch of the tunnels and stuff on the island where the consultants train? I feel like I remember that from the last book. So he's trying to close the lid on this jar where all of these like people's faces in smoke keep trying to push out and scream and whatnot. And he closes it and says, I planted this box of Wally Cobbles almost 1,000 years ago just to sneak a peek at the wild card. Who knew it would be such a pack of boiled bees? Shera stared at him. She'd only known the regent a few days since he'd arrived on the Grey Island, and in that short time she was lucky if she understood 1 in 3 of his words. Apparently, people from the dawn of the Empire spoke like madmen. So he manages to get the lid pressed down and grabs this roll of cloth and then begins to wrap the jar in it so that the lid stays closed. What even is he talking about? Wally Cobbles. And it says, as a distinguished guest, Joran was naturally entitled to the finest accommodations the Consultants Guild chapter house on the western side, finest accommodations of the Consultants Guild chapter house on the western side of the island. But upon being shown to his rooms, he had immediately left, weaving his way through the tunnels of the island until he unearthed these ancient chambers. The miners had no record of this place ever existing, and as far as Shera knew, no consultants had disturbed this room in the 100 of years since Joran last woke. So, that in and of itself, everybody is just like, man, we kind of thought we had more of this figured out. And the moment he's awake, he just shows us this whole section that we didn't even know about. And when he sees Shera, it becomes very clear, like the sort of the issue between the two of them and their means of communication. He says, in the interest of conformity, I too will endeavor to speak like a cart with no wheels, but you should know that I resent the indignity. I'm not entirely sure what a cart with no wheels means, unless he just means like as so simple and stripped down as to be almost not functional. Perhaps that's what he means. So she's watching him, and this thing begins to happen where she's sensing his power and once again thinking about how easy it would be to take his. And she doesn't realize she's leaning forward, and she has her hand on her blade, and she's clearly like making a bit of a spectacle of herself in this like one-on-one conversation. And he has to, it says with one hand, Joran wrapped his bandages around Cyphron. The other, he casually rested on another cloth-wrapped bundle. This one was about 4 feet long, sitting on a crate. Strike your sails and weigh anchor, girl, he said, glancing at her behind his black glasses. His smile was more amused than anything. I have a difficult time restraining people without melting them to black goo. And she realizes she like pulled her blade out and looked like she was about to lunge at him, and is so embarrassed and is like, I don't normally act like this. And he genuinely is like, dude, it's fine. I have been extremely bored, and at least hanging out with you, somebody who is incredibly unstable and unpredictable, it's at least interesting. You're going to get used to it. It's hard at first. I know what it's like, but you will be able to cope more and more. So let's see. I'm running out of time, so I really have to like wrap this part up. But it says, I marvel that the language has stayed as steady as it has. 140 years of sleep this time, and I wake up to find everyone speaks like a flock of Esthers. I suppose the Emperor can keep vocabulary standardized, but still you'd expect some... Where did I put those fire sticks? Matches, Shera said, and he nodded to her. Best invention of your time, I dare say. Firearms are nice and all, but we had cannons and rudimentary muskets last time. I'm a little disappointed in your progress. I had bet with Laura Lee that you would be launching alchemical rounds by now, but still, just lead. And you could forge a sword in the time it takes to reload. Disappointing. Which, that never really occurred to me. Like, if you were going to be asleep and then coming back out, you would have some maybe expectations about what it's going to be like the next time you're back. And then finding out that not all that much has changed, actually, being kind of disappointing, that's funny. I could see that. Like, you know, time traveling ahead from, like, let's say 1890 to 1950. Not all that much. We had started to get into, like, the Industrial Revolution, so there are going to be some changes, but it's not anything like going from, like, 1950 to 2020, you know? So we find out also that the fog around the Grey Island, Bastion's Vale, is straight up not really there anymore. I kind of thought it might come back. Like, I know that Carrion had dropped it in order to help with this fight, but I thought it was going to be an impermanent thing, and it seems like it might be just straight up permanent. And for her part, Shera is glad. She thinks about how oppressive the cloud was, and she hadn't really realized she felt that way until it was gone. And let's see. Okay, here. This time, even with Cyphron sealed, she could distantly feel the presence of consultants crawling all over the terrain. She glanced in that direction, but saw nothing. It wasn't likely a threat, and at the very least, an attacker wouldn't have line of sight from that position. She signaled Joran to come up. There is somebody. He hadn't waited for her signal, which didn't surprise her. He was already halfway up. He reached the top, brushing dust from his coat. "Which way to the nearest alchemist?" he asked, when a crack of thunder interrupted him. Only when he staggered back did Shera realize what the sound meant. A gunshot. Her client had been shot. And that was where I had to stop reading, which, as usual, for all of these books, killed me. It was agonizing. But here I am, sacrificing for all of you. So I hope you appreciate it. But yeah, I'm really, really excited about where we're going in this one. And I'm excited to be back in this world. I think I'm going to be done with Stormlight Archive not too much longer. So I may still go back and re-listen to the last few chapters of the previous book, because it's been a while since I finished the second of the two. But the first one, which was the one from Shera's perspective, it's been a lot longer. So I will keep you all updated. And if you want to chat about it, maybe I'll make a channel in the Discord for this series, see what I can do. All right. Well, thank you very much again to George for commissioning this. Thank you for coming as well. And until next time, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.